Hello everybody, I'm Matt Little and we're going to talk about diagnosing your stance and grip and optimizing it for you. So stance, and I really like to call it structure rather than stance because people think of just the lower body when they think of stance, but the upper body also plays a big role in your shooting. So let's think of that as structure. So structure is the physical shape of my body that makes it the easiest for me to perform the tasks I need to perform in my shooting, which include movement, target transitions, recoil mitigation, all of these factors, right? Grip is how my hands actually made up with the gun to control the gun, to mitigate recoil and be as accurate as possible while I'm shooting rapidly. So the thing about grip and structure is that they're very individual things. The principles are constant for everyone, but how you optimize those principles for your own personal technique varies widely. You know, someone my size with my hands, I mean, I'm 6'3" and I'm basically the missing link. My thumbs don't oppose, my hands aren't really human hands, right? My grip is going to look drastically different than a small statured female with much more petite hands and a much lighter body weight. So these factors all do come into play, but there are some things that are universal and you have to learn how to adopt those principles in your own personal technique. So let's talk about structure first. For structure, a lot of people teach a staggered stance and locking into your natural point of aim. My personal thought on this is that this is an excellent way to shoot if I have one target and there's no movement required from me. The target's not going to move, I'm not going to be changing positions, none of those factors come into play. If I'm shooting a drill that requires speed and accuracy from a static position, I will often stand this way, knowing that I have no other requirements that are going to be put on me in that particular situation. But I always like my default to be a good, natural, relaxed athletic stance, the same way an athlete stands in any field or court sport so they can move optimally, right? So they can use the best principles of athletic performance for their movement and have explosive, controlled, precise movement. So knees slightly bent, hips slightly bent, a little bit of forward bias on the weight. For someone my size, this really should just be thinking about putting the weight more towards the ball of the foot rather than the heel, a very slight shift. Someone smaller, lighter, shorter stature may need to pronounce that forward lean a little bit more to get good recoil mitigation, but it shouldn't be overly done. It shouldn't be at the point where it makes you stiff and rigid in your movement, where you can't move in a relaxed athletic fashion. So that's the basic position. It shouldn't matter if I'm moving and I wind up with my strong side foot forward or my support side foot forward because of the situation I'm in. I should be able to shoot effectively from any of those positions if I follow the right principles, right? Another thing about structure that matters a lot is I need to have my shoulders down and relaxed. I need to not lock my arms. I need to not be rigid in my delts or my traps, because being stiff and rigid inhibits athletic performance. All athletic performance is relaxed and fluid. You've got to be able to stay relaxed. The only tension you should really have when you're shooting is from here down for your grip. Everything else should be nice and relaxed. Now, there are variables here that you have to play with, and it's going to change depending on how your particular body type works best. So there are people that extend the arms in a pronounced fashion. They're still not locking the elbow, but there are top shooters that extend the arms way out, right? There are top shooters that shoot with the elbows very bent. You've got to figure out how much of that bend you need for proper recoil control while still staying relaxed. Other variables. Am I camming the elbow out or is the elbow staying down? There are very good shooters that shoot both ways. You have to experiment with this in your own training and figure out what works for you, okay? So those are two variables. How much bend, how much in and out, right? My hands on the gun, principles that are universal. I want this hand as high up as I can possibly get it while still being effective on the controls, because I want to be as close to the bore axis of the gun as possible. It's simple leverage. The closer I am to the bore axis, the less the recoil is going to move my body, right? Now, thumb placement on here, right? This thumb, your shooting hand thumb, is a bit of a variable that you can play with. See how this wraps around races up and down. You've got to figure out how that's going to work best, especially when you have your other hand on the gun. This part of the hand right here, I try to think of as a wall. I'm not pressing into the gun with it, right? But I'm making it where it's firm enough that when the gun recoils, it's going to kind of bounce off of that, right? Give me better recoil mitigation. This hand, now the classic prescription for this is that the convex and concave curves on the palms of my hand and the heels of my hand are going to fit together, right? So these curves fit together, and that's where my hand's going to fit on the gun. That is a good general prescription, but there are individual variables, right? Here's another variable we have to play with. How much am I canting these fingers down? There are very good shooters who have a very pronounced cant, and there are very good shooters who are almost upright with this hand. So you have to figure out where in that spectrum suits you best for the gun you're shooting and for your hand size, right? Here's another thing to think about, especially for smaller statured shooters. What's more important for my grip, friction or leverage? Friction would be how much surface area I have in contact with the gun. Leverage would be the shape of my grip on the gun. So leverage is more important than friction. My wife, who's a very good competitive shooter, who's very petite, can't mate her hands up on the back of the gun because her hands are small. But because she has good leverage, she can run the gun and recoil very well. So leverage is more important than friction. And the angle of the leverage is going to be dependent on you and your body style and your body type. So I've got to play around with that variable. Another variable that I have to play around with is how far I'm wrapping around this way and where my fingers meet on the other hand. How they're going to meet in on the other hand, right? I've got to figure out that best fit for me. Now, something I always tell people to do once they figure that out is to memorize this point where this finger hits the bottom of the trigger guard, and then use that on the draw and on the reload when they roll their grip back in, or really any time they dismount the gun and bring the gun in and punch it back out. Because then what I do in order to keep my relaxed upper body platform that I need is when I come in, I don't keep the full grip so that I get tight and stiff. Instead, I let that roll on that physical reference point, right? Same thing on the draw. I let that roll on the physical reference point. After the reload, I roll the grip in when I extend it off that same physical reference point. So memorize that, and that'll be the key to duplicating your grip with your support hand every time. All right, how much grip strength do I need? So a good general prescription, a good starting point for figuring this out for yourself is that your shooting hand should be about like a firm handshake. But really what you want is you want the maximum amount of grip pressure you can get with this hand without inhibiting the ability to pull the trigger precisely and properly, right? So if I grip too hard with the rest of my hand, this finger starts to give me trigger freeze and I start to smack the trigger off center so that I'm moving the gun. Instead, if I back off just a little bit so that this finger can function properly, I have the right amount of grip pressure on this hand. A good starting point on this hand really is I want to grip as hard as I possibly can without the tension creeping past my elbows. So one of the things I tell my students when I talk about this is I want to see their fingernails and the tips of their fingers turn white from how hard they're gripping, right? That's how hard I want to grip with this hand. You want to wind up bringing this in and really just crushing the gun with this hand as strong as you can without creating too much fatigue or too much upper body stiffness and tension. The other thing I want to think about is the thumbs, right? If I steer the thumbs into the slide, I can cause a malfunction. If I push into the frame with the thumb, I can drive the gun to the right, to my strong side. What I want to do is I want to have kind of a similar feeling to what I do with this part of my hand here. I want to make the meaty part of my palm here and this thumb where they're like a wall. So I'm not putting pressure into the gun, I'm not driving the gun with it, but what I'm doing is if I do like an overly aggressive trigger press, it's going to stop it. It's going to be like a wall that stops it from going too far. And that's a pretty fine point, but it's something you can work on in your training and get better results for your recoil management and your trigger control, right? Now, the way I'm going to diagnose this for myself and experiment with this and figure out the best grip and structure for me is simply by shooting in an experimental fashion. I'm going to shoot a couple of rounds, see how it recoils, figure out what I didn't like about it, and see what variable I can change in my grip and structure to try to fix it. And I go through that process and figure out exactly how to optimize my structure, my grip for a particular gun and for myself. This is a process you need to go through whenever you start shooting a new gun to figure out how best to run that gun when you're shooting at speed. I have never shot this gun before, so right now I'm about to go live and we're going to go through that process and I'm going to show you how I do it. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do, the first rounds I fire with this gun, like I said, I've never shot this gun before. I want to see what it wants to do in recoil without me putting any muscular output back into the gun. So I'm going to allow the gun to recoil as much as it wants to and evaluate the path of the sights and how the gun rises, how far it rises up. Now, one point on this though is I can't let the gun jump around in my support hand, right? So I want to have a firm, strong grip on the gun like I would if I was shooting normally and trying to mitigate the recoil. But in this case, I'm going to allow the gun to recoil like it wants to with the rest of my body, with the rest of my upper body. And then I'm going to deliberately bring the sights down and do that again. I'm going to do a few reps of that so that I can get a feeling for what the gun does in recoil when it's left to its own devices. Here we go. All right, so now that I've given some information to my subconscious, right? We all have this subconscious supercomputer that will figure this stuff out for us if we let it. But like any other computer, it's very literal. So I have to give it the right data and give it the right desired end state and then let it figure these things out. So now that I've done that, I'm going to start putting a little bit of effort back into the gun, try to mitigate some recoil. Now, when we do this, what I don't want to do is the old school locked out and rigid, because then it moves my whole body. If I'm relaxed here, but tight in the grip, it's almost like a whip cracking in my arms. So the gun's going to kind of do this, and then I can put a little more effort back into it. I'm going to fire a few rounds, and each round I'm going to put a little bit more effort back into the gun until I put too much in and it drives the shot down. Here we go. So now I have a good feel for how much effort to put back into the gun. Now what I want to do is I want to play with the shape and the pressures of the grip and really try to fine-tune how the sights track. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to fire 2 rounds in rapid succession and evaluate where the second round goes, because that's going to tell me how well I'm mitigating the recoil. Then I'm going to change a variable, try to make it better, and do it again. Okay, the second round went just slightly low left, just a little bit. So I'm going to increase the pressure here just a touch. And I'm going to try to change the cant of my hand just a little bit more where the fingers are pointed a little bit more down. So that time I put too much pressure in and now the second shot went slightly right. So now I'm going to relax a little bit on that. And those were just fine. So that's an abbreviated version of the process I go through every time I pick up a new gun to figure out how best to run that particular gun. So I would highly recommend working on these things for yourself, figuring out how to make your grip, your structure, your stance as personally effective as you possibly can. And especially if you change platforms and pick up a different gun, go through this process again and learn how to run that gun. Thanks everybody. I hope you got something good out of this, and I hope to see you all on the range soon.